All right, today we're talking about the original 13 lineup, ranking them from worst to best. And here's the thing, there are no worst, there's no bad figure here. I love all of them. I love some more than others, and so that's what is going to make it fun. But we'll talk all 13. They're slowly doling them out in classified form, and we're not going to get them very fast, I think, because they all have a very similar look to them, right? And so they have to do some work to make them more unique characters. They're giving to us one at a time, and hopefully eventually we'll get all of them. And then something about that makes the original 13 that they all look vaguely similar, and all of that is on one hand maybe not as exciting, or maybe not as exciting as others. It's not as exciting unless I'm some like Quick Kick, who's a weird dude running around with no shirt on all the time and not wearing shoes. That doesn't really make sense. But there is something very cool about the original 13, is that for me they really was the time when they really felt like an actual military unit that you could believe in. So when you first got that set and that you saw the whole setup, all the figures, all the vehicles, it looked like something that was just over the border of reality, right? Because I think, there were little tiny sci-fi elements that just made it a bit of a heightened reality, but barely. So it was a very cool world that you were thrown into, and I'll always have love for these characters. Having said that, though, some of them are better than others. So let's start with number 13. Now, a couple things to think about with these is that one of the things that makes them very similar is they basically all have one of three, with the exception of Stalker, Snake Eyes, and Scarlet. The rest all have one of three faces. They either have receding hairline monkey face, pointy nose soy face, or beard. That's basically the three faces that you would get. You get variations of color, but they are going to have one of those three faces, which does make them seem a little bit more generic and not as exciting as later iterations of G.I. Joe. So number 13 is Short Fuse. I love Short Fuse. He was actually the first figure I ever got. And I remember going to the store and seeing that big explosion and not knowing what the hell it was, and seeing his weapon, not knowing what that was either, and picking him up and bringing him home and trying to figure out a way to play with him. We didn't have any villains or anything, and automatically I was right in love. So a lot of love for the character, but I do think as a character, if I got to pick one at the bottom, he would be, and one of the reasons why, well, he's got pointy soy face. The other bit would be his weapon. His weapon is just not as exciting or useful as other weapons here. It's like a mortar is just not that useful for a strike team. A mortar is good in like war, in just like a battlefield war circumstance where you've got tons of villains, and then you're trying to take them out. It's the kind of weapon you're using coordinates, dropping an explosive on somebody from far away. There's better ways to do that now, but I just feels like Short Fuse would just not be that useful. Good character though, in that Short Fuse got his name because he's prone to fits of anger. He's an explosive expert. What I'm hoping is when they do a classified version of Short Fuse, they'll expand him to not just be a mortar soldier and more of general explosives, somebody who works with explosives, as I just don't see a mortar being that useful in this day and age and in a strike team. That puts him at the bottom of my list. Number 12, we've got Grunt. Now, Grunt is, by definition, the most generic character we can have. He is a grunt. He's literally the definition of a character that you throw into the front lines. Where it puts him a little bit above Short Fuse, though, for me, is he just had one of the best artworks. So one of the best, cover art by Hector Garrido. His face was so strong and so striking, and the pose was so striking. But otherwise, the figure itself was as generic as it can possibly be. He had monkey face. He came with an M16 and a backpack. Nothing too exciting, and he doesn't stand out in really any way. And so that puts him towards the end. Number 11 is Zap. Zap Rafael Melendez. Like Zap for a couple reasons. He's a bazooka soldier. Awesome to have a bazooka, obviously. Zap is also our Latino character, the first Latino character. G.I. Joe was always diverse, by the way. Always had a wide variety of people represented in it, even from the get-go. Zap was later represented in a new character, a new version. In the later years of G.I. Joe, it was kind of going downhill, but I thought his figure was cool looking. It was a decent figure. Zap again had receding hair monkey face. There was nothing there telling me that made him special in his look, other than that bazooka. That bazooka was enough to put him up higher on the list, because you always need a bazooka, right? I'd love to fire one off tomorrow. All right, number 10, we have Ralph Pulaski. Steeler. Now, Steeler was a great figure because he came with the Mobat. But we don't get a lot of lore about Steeler. He doesn't show up in a lot of media. Doesn't show up really much in the comic book. Doesn't show up much in the cartoon. And so it's kind of hard to really grasp some of these characters when they don't really have that much foothold in the world. But he had a cool look. He had that very interesting visor. I imagine was used in seeing long range or infrared or something. And he rode the Mobat.
Enemy blockade! Send in the G.I. Joe motorized battle tank!
You can make it go left, right, forwards, and backwards. The G.I. Joe battle tank.
Smash the blockade! What a tank!
Each sold separately.
Which was one of the best things you ever had as a kid. You loved the Mobat. So we'll give him a little bit of a higher marking just for coming with the Mobat. So Steeler, when we get our lore from G.I. Joe, we're either getting it one of three places. We're getting it from the cartoon, my favorite, the comic book, or we're getting it from the file card themselves. But I gotta say, after rereading the file cards in the original 13, Larry had not hit his stride in writing file cards yet. He wasn't getting that creative. There's not that much to them. So what you're finding in these characters is not probably coming much from the file card, with a couple of exceptions. We don't know much about Steeler here, but what we do know is he does not like authority. And even that is something that's so great that the file cards do, is they just give you these little distinctions of character that allow you to find something to grab onto, to make them more of a character and deepen the lore and make it more fun. Without the file cards, without that, they are just what they look like. And this is why I think it's the biggest mistake in the world that the new classified line does not come with file cards. And once again, get on that shit. Put file cards in. Number 9, we have Grand Slam. And now Grand Slam is basically Flash with a monkey face receding hairline. So Grand Slam's not the most exciting character, being that he really does look a lot like another character. Again, he's another one that we just don't see a lot of Grand Slam. He doesn't show up much. He doesn't do a lot in either the comic book or the cartoon. Barely shows up in the cartoon at all, and the comic book a few times here and there. The only thing we really know about Grand Slam is that he loves science fiction, which sort of seems like his world, as he has two of the big sci-fi weapons. So Grand Slam was packaged with the HAL, the heavy artillery laser, and also packaged with the jump jetpack. So you most likely had two Grand Slams. You had one with the red suit that came with the HAL, and one with the silver patches that came with the jump jetpack. So it felt like he was almost like a sci-fi weapon expert that would work on various different things, and that gives him a little bit of an edge. Now he's a bit more interesting. The next, and this is like, I'm not going by the character, because if this is by character, he'd be one of my favorite characters of all time. I'm going by where he sat in the lineup in the original 13, and this is Hawk. And I think Hawk, this really didn't get his stride until he had his second version, and he became the sort of elder statesman of the G.I. Joe, where he really fit more of a general role, and then he was very cool. What I loved about Hawk then was his job was to sit at a desk, and it was the job of guys like Flint and Stalker and Duke to go out and lead, and Beachhead to go out and lead the team into missions while he would, you know, shout orders out and work on strategic planning and deal with the, you know, the generals and all that kind of thing. And then eventually he'd have to go out and he'd have to whoop some ass too, right? That would always be that moment where it's like, oh, the general's stepping into a Sky Striker and he's gonna go out and fight. And that was always something that really was fun in the lore and something fun to play with. But this original figure that came with the MMS was just not a very exciting figure. He had pointy soy face, and he was just a very generic looking figure. Didn't stand out in any way, and even though he was the team leader, it just didn't make him that exciting. It's just, you know, the team leader is never the most exciting character. So that's why he sits at number 8. Clinton Abernathy, that would be Hawk. The next one we have on the list is Alvin R. Kibbe, aka Breaker. We've got Breaker here, right? Came with the Ram cycle. Now, Breaker was not something I would, you know, the Ram cycle was all rock and roll as far as I was concerned. He was the one I would think iconically comes with the Ram cycle. But it makes sense because Breaker is, again, not the most exciting figure. He's a communications expert. He came with a helmet and a radio. No kid wants to play with a radio. They want to play with a gun or an exploder or a bazooka. This would normally put him lower on the list, but what I love about Breaker is he had a lot of personality and he did have a lot of lore. In the comic book, there was a moment in which he was always chewing gum. So he'd have these big, like, pink bubbles coming out all the time. And in one of the comics, he used that gum to, they were out of ammo, and he used an amplified sound of the bubble blowing up to make the villains think that there was a cannon going off. Something like that, right? That was kind of fun. And he had that pink bubble gum. And when you had an earlier iteration of this figure, you got these 2-packs back in the day, somewhere around when the 25th anniversary figures were coming out. They came out with a 2-pack and it had a Breaker, and he had the bubble gum balloon that you could stick in his mouth, which I think was cool. I think that would have been a nice addition for this figure, frankly. I think if you want to have Breaker, you should have him chewing bubble gums. That makes him stand out as a character. So he has some things that make him stand out as a character. I think this figure is great. I think the face sculpt is great. So I think they updated him really nicely. And even though he is just the communications expert, never the most exciting, never the thing that you want to play with as a kid, he had more to do in the comic book and was useful in that way. Number 6, we have Anthony Gambello, aka Flash. And this is a figure I really want them to come out with for a classified, a laser trooper. What I love about Flash is sort of the perfect note of where I like G.I. Joe to sit in on the sci-fi world, right? Where it's just like he's just a little bit advanced. He's got a laser gun, but he doesn't use it the way they use lasers as stormtroopers use lasers. He uses it to cut through things, right? He's concentrating, and his power is that he's so still he can, you know, use to cut through metal. And we see him cutting through walls in the first issue of G.I. Joe and other things. And so that weapon is unique and pushes G.I. Joe into a realm of science fiction that I'm very comfortable with, which is just like a hair. Like, we're going to have this stuff tomorrow. If we don't already, we'll probably already have it, but I don't see it in use. But we can imagine this is going to be something that will be in use. Later on, we get into the crazy stuff, and we've got, you know, bizarro weapons and sci-fi weapons that don't really match up with reality. It tends to take me out of it a little bit, and so Flash hits a perfect note of just a little bit of science fiction within what is a very realistic military world. So I always love that character for that, and that's one of my most anticipated figures in the G.I. Joe Classified line, and certainly my most anticipated of the original 13 that we haven't gotten so far. Next, number 5, we have Clutch, the Vamp Driver. Clutch is a real character, and one of those, now we're getting into the realm of, and all the rest of these stand out as real characters with really interesting personalities, unique looks. that have stood out and became a part of the lore, and all had more to do in the comic book. Given more to do in the comic book or the cartoon or whatever. Clutch, as the vamp driver, drove one of the best and most interesting vehicles. But he was also a character. He was like a Jersey guy, right? And we had some great stories in the comic book where he goes home, and very early on in the comic where he goes to his hometown and shit goes wrong, and he's got his own little adventure. But he's also described as, you know, he's a guy that still calls girls chicks. You know, he greases his hair. He's just, you know, he's a grease monkey. He's a guy from another time, and that makes him stand out as being a really interesting character, and he's one of the best in the line. That is Lance Steinberg, a.k.a. Clutch, the Vamp Driver. The file card describes him as he greases his hair with motor oil, chews on the same toothpick for months, and still calls girls chicks. You know, he's a character. He's a funny character. Not the most perfect guy, and I think that makes him fun to have around, fun to play with. I remember there was moments in the comic book where he's just like sexually harassing Scarlet, and she, you know, throws him and, you know, and kicks his ass basically in front of everybody. And there's things like that which I don't know, feel realistic and feel kind of fun, and so he just adds a lot. Next in line we have number 4, Craig S. McConnell, aka Rock and Roll. Rock and Roll was a heavy machine gunner, California dude, bodybuilder, and which became apparent in his later version. We had the most ridiculous guns you could ever see. These 2 massive Gatling guns and one-handed cannons, which nobody's carrying a Gatling gun with one hand, let alone 2 of them. It also isn't heard that they just outdid themselves with this new iteration of Rock and Roll, giving him tattoos, giving him metal hands, you know, just loading him out where he still keeps the spirit of the original, but also feels new and fresh, and then transcends the fact that a lot of these original guys all look the same. Rock and Roll had beard, he had the bearded look, basically the same head sculpt as Clutch, but had a yellow beard instead of a black beard. But now we get Rock and Roll and how he should look. He, to me, was the one who was, I'd put him on the Ram cycle, because in that first issue of G.I. Joe, we see him on the Ram cycle, flying over everything, dropping bombs, using the Gatling gun, and so he held a little bit more of a space for me as one of the main characters and the best figures in the original line. But now we get to our last few. These are the icons of this first line, and you're probably not going to have a hard time guessing who these 3 are, right? Maybe there's a shift, but I'm going to guess that you're going to have basically the same top 3. My top 3, number 3, Lonzo Wilkinson, aka Stalker. Stalker, one of the best characters. This is actually one of the newer version of the old 3 3/4 inch. This is Stalker. Unfortunate nickname for this era, right? Like, I wouldn't want to be called a stalker. I mean, a couple girls called me a stalker, and now I have a restraining order against me. But back then, for him, that was a very cool name. I remember thinking, man, that's a badass name, right? And then he's described as like a jungle cat, you know, and he grew up in gangs and fought in gangs and sort of transcended that, went into the military. Then we also have a lot of lore with him being part of the trio in Vietnam with Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes, them creating that friendship and then carrying that friendship into the G.I. Joe team. Stalker was also one of the highest ranked in the G.I. Joe world, and I always made him second in command. For me, he was the second in command of Hawk, because I felt like that was a natural progression. Because if he was that high ranked in the first year of G.I. Joe, I would imagine he would raise in the ranks as the years go on. So for me, he was second in command. You had Hawk, and then you had Stalker. They did have later iterations of Stalker. They had an Arctic version that was really good and really really fun, that came with a canoe and or kayak, and then we also had another iteration that came with voice commands that was weird, giant backpack nobody could carry, and had explosion and machine gun sounds in the back. It was like, okay, I unscrewed that shit and took the dumb backpack off and was happy to have a new Stalker figure because he was always one of my favorites. And this new classified version is also a good version of Stalker. So there have been some great figures of Stalker too, which I think helps allow the characters to survive and go past their original iteration. And here, this new Stalker is fantastic. But they also came out with a great Stalker in the Pursuit of Cobra line. He had some dreads. He had a pretty good knife. He had a good look to him. I think this is a dead-on perfect version of the character that's an update of the original, but gives us some new things. For me, Stalker also was the guy that the jump pack was his, right? So G.I. Joe! G.I. Joe is there! Mostly, I guess I'm basing it on that first issue of G.I. Joe. He was the guy in the jump pack. He was the one flying around, dropping grenades on Cobra soldiers from in the air, and so I always gave him the jump pack. I thought that was fun. But character that has a lot of lore. The first black character in the line, a character with a lot of history, a lot of interest, and one of the best characters in the story. Number 2, first woman in G.I. Joe. I have a particular love for this character, as I know you do too. I named my daughter after her. Okay, so I love this character. Scarlet is a badass girl before badass girls were a cliche in movies as they are now. One of the coolest things about the Scarlet character is in this, in the first comic book. For me, her in the comic book, this is where I get my Scarlet. She's cool in the cartoon too. She's a badass. There's this moment where she's flying overhead and captured by Destro, and she grabs her crossbow with her feet and just shoots down the plane she's in to save the day. She's willing to just die and kill her and Destro to save everybody.
Destro.
You're a paradox, Scarlet. You little fool! You've used the controls! We're both finished!
So she was a great character in the cartoon. She's obviously one of the biggest characters in the entire world. I actually loved in the new Snake Eyes movie. I thought Samara Weaving was a great Scarlet, and to me that was a movie that didn't really work, but the way where they nailed it was the bringing in of Scarlet, and the couple scenes she was in, she sort of nailed it. I loved her weapons. What really worked for me and made her such a great character is all of the little hidden weapons on her body. You can look around and see, and they were used in that first issue of the comic book. There's a great moment in which Cobra Commander is holding Dr. Burkhart by gunpoint, and Scarlet takes a shuriken from her, right here, takes it off her glove and swings it, nails Cobra Commander in the wrist, and he drops his gun. She had that. She had a little derringer right there. She had some knives. She's got these hidden weapons, and she also has that great crossbow, which you could use in so many different ways. I would always have it have, explosive arrows that could shoot, grappling hooks across.
Awake down there?
We're coming out with a new one finally. We're going to get our good classic version of Scarlet, and she's going to have a couple of different arrows. It looks like they nailed it on this one. I've been waiting for a good Scarlet. Don't mind the others that they came out with. I thought from that first round of really crappy figures in the classified line, the Scarlet one was one of the ones that was okay. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a dead-on nail of the character. I think the Snake Eyes is a pretty dead-on perfect figure. I think the Destro one is a pretty good figure. It wasn't that, but it wasn't bad either, and I did pick that one up. One of the other things I love about Scarlet as a character is there is a lot of depth, and there's a lot of interesting things about her, especially in the comic book, especially when you count in the idea that she is in love with Snake Eyes, right? I never liked the cartoon where she's with Duke. Always rejected that. No, Scarlet and Snake Eyes to me is like a great love story. Yes, I know. That's, to me, Scarlet and Snake Eyes, like, you know, the man gave his face for her. You know, he has no face, but she doesn't care that he has no face and can't talk. She loves him, and you know, they have this great history together. There's this great moment in Silent Interlude where he's come to save her. She sees Storm Shadow, picks up his katana and hurls it at Snake Eyes, and it's gonna pierce Snake Eyes right through the chest. And so she drops down on the claw and lands, and she's gonna sacrifice herself to save Snake Eyes, but he doesn't need it. He just goes boom and claps and grabs the sword and just tosses to the side because he's a badass. But I just love that she's just self-sacrificed. She's a real hero. She's not like these, you know, strong female characters in movies where, like Captain Marvel, where it feels forced and it doesn't represent anything. She's strong because she's sacrificing. She's badass. She's trained herself through years of discipline. She's risen through the ranks. She can deal with the world as it is. She's highly trained. That she can, she's an undercover, you know, expert, and just overall a badass character with lots and lots of story throughout the years, and one of the best characters, like top characters of all time in the entire series, and top female heroes of all time. Maybe the best female hero of all time? I don't know. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say maybe. You might say Princess Leia's better. I'd say she kicked the shit out of Princess Leia. I'm sticking to that. Obviously, my number one is probably your number one, unless one of those hipster take people that doesn't like Snake Eyes. But Snake Eyes is the greatest character in the G.I. Joe world, maybe Destro. I prefer my Snake Eyes as the original Commando version. I know sometimes the great version with the visor, which has become the more iconic look for Snake Eyes. But to me, I think I get a little ninja'd out sometimes, and I'm a little sick of him as a ninja. I prefer to think of Snake Eyes as he's a commando. He's a commando that has ninja training rather than he's a ninja that became a commando. I like the idea of this. The ninja training is a backstory, but a commando, somebody you just send down into the war behind enemy lines, just going around wasting people. And I think the way I like to see Snake Eyes is like in Resolute, right? In Snake Eyes in Resolute, he's not doing things like, you know, Ray Park in the Rise of Cobra movie where he's just flipping around with his weird rubber mouth. You know, he's like Jason Voorhees. He's just quiet, stalking people, just smoking them from they don't even see him coming. He just kills them one after one, right? And to me, that's like, to me, he's like just almost an invincible warrior. I love the way it would make him fight. Just nobody could take him, maybe other than Storm Shadow, but he would go in and it could be him against 20, but also in a believable way. You know, to me, it's like he just is stretching the boundaries of how good a person can be at fighting, killing, being a soldier without stretching beyond and being something supernatural. He is at that border of that good, right? And that is the most dangerous man alive. But also, again, he's got such a crazy and fascinating backstory. I love the boldness of having your main character. I mean, Snake Eyes is the main character of G.I. Joe, the comic. If you read the comic, you know that. Snake Eyes, in the cartoon, he was a side character. In the comic book, he is the main character. What I love about that is you're having a main character that cannot speak, that does not have a face. It's such a bold and interesting decision. And yet he is the most interesting character in the story. His weird, tragic backstory with Storm Shadow and the death of his sister, and how it's intertwined with Cobra Commander. There's just so much to it, so much tragedy, and yet he is also like a hero. He's a really good person. What I love about Snake Eyes, and what I hate about the new movie Snake Eyes, where they made him kind of a bad person, but that's not how he is. If you read the comic and you got into the comic, it's like, no, he looks bad. this was the idea of Snake Eyes when they had him. They basically, you know, they probably know the idea of Snake Eyes was they wanted to save costs, so they wanted a figure that was just all black, so they don't have to paint him. They'll save some costs, and so they made this character that's all black, and it ends up being their most iconic character, the most iconic hero, to the point where kids are playing him in freaking Fortnite. Yeah, and you know, he is what a lot of people think of as G.I. Joe. But what's great about that is he looked like a bad guy. I remember getting him and going, oh, he's the bad guy, right? Because he's just a mysterious masked dude in all black. And then you realize that no, he's got this tragic backstory, and he's lost his face, he's lost his voice, but he's pure good. He is self-sacrificing. There's a moment in which he meets Scarlet for the first time, and she's, you know, trying to prove herself against the men, beating up the men, and in your hand-to-hand. And he goes to challenge her, and somebody says, why don't you take on him? Knowing he could probably take her. And you know, they tussle, and she tosses him, and and we get inside of her head, and she says, I could feel his control. He let me do it, but he made it look real because he doesn't got nothing to prove, right? So he's just like, to me, he always was just like in that way that, you know, something like Captain America was a good hero for a young kid, is that it shows you like this is who you should be, this is the way you behave, this is the type of person you want to be, and this is what heroic actually means. It's not about power, it's not being about the strongest, it's about, you know, who you are and how you act. And that's why it was such a sin to have him be like an awful person in the Snake Eyes Origins movie. We won't even get on the whole other topic. But anyway, so Snake Eyes is absolutely my number one. I know it's a cliche because he's the number one character in general, but he's the best character. I think he's the best character in the series, and certainly the best character in the original 13. Maybe my favorite character of all time. So that's it. That's my take on the original 13. Let me know what you think, what your order would be, if you have any that you like more, or who your favorite is, or your least favorite. If you want more reviews, I'm doing a series where I compare the original G.I. Joes to the classified version as a way of doing an unboxing video in a slightly different way. Talk about the lore, we talk about the character, we talk about what it means, we talk about nostalgia. So I'll see you at the next video.